The conference hall in Geneva shimmered with polished marble floors and soft, golden light from suspended chandeliers. Outside, snow pressed gently against the windows, muffling the world beyond, while inside, a restless audience gathered, waiting for voices that would shape global dialogue. Students, diplomats, and journalists filled the seats, buzzing with anticipation for the youth summit that had promised both new visions and confrontations. At the heart of the program stood the unlikely presence of Baron Trump, carrying the aura of his family name, and Ibrahim Traoré, representing a generation of African sovereignty. When Baron rose to speak, silence overtook the room. His tall frame and careful diction gave him an air of confidence, but his words cut sharply. He declared that Ibrahim Traoré was unfit to lead, casting doubt on his legitimacy, on his methods, and even on the idea of his people's right to self-determination. The statement landed with weight, echoing through the walls like a sudden crack of thunder in the middle of a calm night. The faces in the audience froze, caught between disbelief and outrage. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré, who sat still, his hands resting lightly on the table before him. His expression revealed nothing. No anger, no surprise, no rush to respond. That very restraint seemed to deepen the tension in the hall. It was a silence heavier than any shouted reply, and it forced the audience to wait, to measure their own feelings against the words that had just been spoken. The stillness of Traoré became a mirror, reflecting the discomfort now crawling through the crowd. A group of young African students shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering to one another. To them, Traoré symbolized dignity reclaimed, and Baron's words felt like an insult, not only to him, but to their own histories. The clash was not just between two men. It was between two legacies, two visions of the world. The hall had been expecting debate, but what received in that instant was something more volatile. The opening moment of a story that would be remembered far beyond. Geneva, Baron Trump's words carried the weight of a dynasty. For years he had lived under the shadow of a name that defined American politics, wealth, and controversy. Every step he took was measured against his father's legacy. Every opinion amplified by a media eager to judge him before he even spoke. In Geneva, that shadow felt heavier than ever, as though he were not speaking for himself, but for an entire lineage of privilege and power. His criticism of Traoré was less about one man and more about protecting an inherited worldview. On the opposite side of the hall, Ibrahim Traoré represented a different kind of legacy. His rise was not built on wealth or inherited prestige, but on the struggle of a people who had fought against decades of exploitation. Born into modest surroundings in Burkina Faso, he carried with him the echoes of colonial scars, of communities that had been denied their sovereignty. Unlike Baron, his authority was not a birthright. It was earned through conviction, through risk, and through the courage to confront the status quo. The contrast between the two men was striking. Baron embodied the polished surfaces of Manhattan towers, where power often passed silently from one generation to the next. Traoré carried the red dust of Ouagadougou, the sound of crowded markets, the rhythm of voices demanding dignity. Their worlds could not have been more different, and yet here they stood, facing each other in the same hall, bound by a moment neither had fully chosen, but both had to endure. The collision of their legacies created a tension that no moderator could ease. For the audience, the moment became more than a political disagreement. It was a clash of symbols, the West's legacy of dominance against Africa's cry for recognition. Some saw Baron as arrogant, others as simply repeating the lessons he had inherited. Traoré, meanwhile, became the embodiment of resilience. The contrast set the stage for the deeper revelation to come when history itself would enter the room and turn Baron's words against him. The moment Baron's words echoed through the hall, a ripple spread across the audience. It began with soft murmurs, scattered whispers carried between rows of seats, but quickly grew into a low current of discontent. Students from African universities leaned toward each other, their brows furrowed, their voices laced with disbelief. The insult did not feel like a simple remark. It felt like a dismissal of their identity, their history, and their aspirations. For them, the sting was personal. In one corner, a group of seasoned diplomats exchanged restrained but knowing glances. They had seen such dismissals before, subtle and overt, in decades of conferences where African leaders were patronized or ignored. Yet this moment was different. The insult had come not from a hardened statesman, but from a young man representing the next generation of global leadership. To them, the weight of Barron's words raised an even deeper question. Would history continue to repeat itself through new heirs of old powers? Journalists seated with their cameras and notepads caught every flicker of reaction. Lenses shifted from Barron's confident posture to the composed stillness of Traoré, and then to the restless audience. Each frame captured the silent story unfolding, one of defiance, dignity, and growing solidarity. In the quiet exchanges, in the whispered outrage, the hall itself seemed to pulse with energy. Something intangible was being born in that uneasy silence. For the younger attendees, especially those who had grown up with stories of leaders like Sankara and Mandela, the moment ignited a fire. They whispered names of the past, comparing Barron's words to the arrogance once faced by their ancestors. Yet at the same time, their eyes remained fixed on Traoré. They wondered not just how he would respond, but whether his response could transform the insult into something greater, something unforgettable. As the whispers thickened in the air, all eyes turned to Ibrahim Traoré. He remained seated, shoulders steady, gaze calm, his posture unshaken by the insult hurled against him. Where many expected a fiery rebuke or a sharp counterattack, he offered silence. That silence, however, was not emptiness. It carried weight, forcing every person in the hall to sit with the discomfort of Barron's words. His restraint created a space where dignity spoke louder than any argument could. The stillness was deliberate. Traoré had long understood that true leadership was not only about words, but about presence. He had been forged in the crucible of difficult choices, where one misstep could cost lives or weaken the fragile sovereignty of his nation. To erupt in anger would only prove his critic right. Instead, he embodied the discipline of a soldier and the patience of a statesman, turning the insult into an opportunity for reflection. His silence became a mirror, and in it, others began to see themselves. The audience grew restless. Some expected confrontation, others yearned for defense, but what they encountered instead was something disarming. The composure of Traoré began to shift the atmosphere. The murmurs softened. The cameras lingered longer on his face, and the tension that filled the air began to bend into something new. Curiosity. What was he holding back? What did his silence conceal? The power of the moment was not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Barron, too, felt the weight of that silence. His words had been meant to provoke, to challenge, yet the lack of immediate response unsettled him. He adjusted his notes, glanced around the room, and for the first time seemed unsure. Without lifting a finger, Traoré had begun to reclaim the stage. His composure transformed an insult into suspense, preparing the ground for what no one expected to come next. The silence that wrapped the hall broke when Barron shifted forward and reached for a small device resting on the podium. His movements were careful, almost hesitant, but there was a spark of defiance in his eyes. He pressed a button, and suddenly, a voice, old and grainy, filled the chamber. At first, the audience leaned back in confusion, uncertain of what they were hearing. The recording crackled with age, carrying the weight of history across decades. As the words grew clearer, the room stilled. The voice belonged to an American statesman, long gone, speaking of Africa's right to sovereignty, of dignity and justice, denied for too long. It was not the voice of condemnation that many had expected Barron to unveil, but of recognition. The hall, moments earlier brimming with tension, fell into A, silence deeper than before. Listeners felt as though the past had entered the present to demand attention. The message was haunting in its honesty. It spoke of promises made but never kept, of A, responsibility that had been forgotten amid shifting global powers. Students clutched their pens tighter. Diplomats leaned forward in their seats, and even seasoned journalists paused there. Note-taking. The recording revealed truths often buried. Truths that resonated with the very presence of Ibrahim Traoré, sitting quietly at the table. The insult was already fading into irrelevance. Tro did not move, yet the room felt as though it had turned toward him. The irony was sharp. Barron had sought to discredit, but instead had unearthed a voice that strengthened the very ideals Trey represented. The hall now waited, not for Barron's commentary, but for what this rediscovered truth would mean. In that moment, history had spoken louder than either man, and the balance of the room shifted entirely. The recording carried the hall back to another era, when the world stood at the threshold of change but faltered in its commitments. The voice belonged to a figure once celebrated for bold words yet remembered for unfulfilled deeds. He had spoken of partnership with Africa, of supporting nations as they rebuilt their futures free from exploitation. His promise, powerful in its delivery, had inspired hope across continents. Yet, decades passed and the words dissolved into silence, never matched by action. For many in the audience, the revelation was painful. Older diplomats recalled those speeches from their youth when they believed true equality between nations might finally arrive. Younger students listened in disbelief, realizing that the struggles of their generation had been acknowledged long ago, yet abandoned. The past seemed to accuse the present, exposing a betrayal that stretched across time. It was no longer about Barron's insult or even Traor's restraint. It was about promises broken and dignity denied. The weight of that forgotten promise pressed against the room. It stirred memories of leaders like Sanker and Crummer, who had warned that foreign powers would speak of freedom while tightening their grip. The recording became more than evidence. It became a mirror reflecting the unfinished journey of African sovereignty. The hall no longer looked to Barron, nor even to the absent statesman, but to the man who sat silently, embodying the struggle that promise had betrayed. Traor's silence deepened in meaning. He did not need to rise or point a finger. The recording had already delivered the indictment, not against him, but against those who doubted Africa's right to lead itself. The promise, once buried, now stood exposed before the world. Its return reshaped the narrative entirely, making Tro not the accused but the vindicated. Barron's face tightened as the recording faded into silence. He had expected it to cast doubt on Tro, but instead it illuminated the hypocrisy of generations past, including his own. In that instant, the youthful confidence with which he declared Traoré unfit began to unravel. The weight of history pressed against him, exposing how little he understood of the struggle that shaped the African leader sitting before him. His words suddenly felt shallow, echoing without anchor. Across the hall, the generational divide became palpable. Barron carried the inheritance of privilege, born into skyscrapers and guarded by legacy. Traoré carried the inheritance of resistance, shaped by hardship and fueled by the memory of injustice. The clash was not simply between two individuals, but between two timelines, one that had too often ignored history, and another that bore its scars with pride. The collision of these legacies created a silence more telling than any applause or protest. The younger attendees leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Barron. For them, his stumble was not merely personal. It symbolized the arrogance of a generation that believed power alone defined leadership. In contrast, Traoré's composure spoke of a leadership rooted in sacrifice, dignity, and accountability. The comparison was unavoidable. One youth carried an inherited crown, the other a burden of generations, and it was the burden that commanded respect. Barron lowered his gaze for the first time, uncertain. His Challenge had turned against him, reshaping the hall's perception entirely. The recording had bridged decades, reminding everyone that leadership is not passed down, but earned. Generations collided that day, not in violence, but in truth, and in that collision, Traoré emerged not diminished but magnified, while Barron began to confront the shadows of his own inheritance. The hall seemed to breathe differently after the recording ended. What had begun as a clash of egos had become something deeper, almost sacred. Students who moments earlier whispered in anger now sat in reflective silence, their eyes fixed on Traoré. For them, this was no longer about Barron's provocation, but about reclaiming the dignity their ancestors had long been denied. The insult had dissolved, leaving only the weight of truth. Diplomats shifted uneasily in their seats, realizing they had witnessed history bend before their eyes. Some scribbled notes furiously, aware that tomorrow's headlines would not focus on Barron's words, but on the forgotten promise that resurfaced in Geneva. The calm figure Traoré had become larger than life, transformed into a symbol not only of resistance, but of patience, of strength carried quietly. The narrative was no longer his to chase. It had been given to him by the very forces that sought to weaken him. Journalists adjusted their lenses, capturing the stillness that carried more power than speeches. The click of cameras echoed, like quiet applause, sealing the moment into permanence. For readers and viewers across the world, the images would tell a story of composure triumphing over insult, of history resurfacing at the perfect moment. The audience's perception shifted collectively from skepticism to respect, from outrage to admiration. In that transformation, Barron himself became almost invisible. The young man who had sought to define another's fitness was now overshadowed by the truth he had unwillingly unearthed. The hall was no longer his arena. It belonged to Traoré, to the students, to the forgotten voices resurrected by the recording. What began as confrontation ended as revelation, and the audience left carrying more than memory. They carried conviction. Barron sat frozen, his fingers still resting on the device that had betrayed him. The certainty with which he had spoken only minutes before now seemed naive, almost childish. He replayed his own words in his mind, realizing how hollow they sounded against the weight of the recording. For the first time, he was not only facing the crowd's judgment, but his own. The silence that once empowered him now pressed heavily, forcing him inward. He began to understand what he had overlooked. Leadership was not about polished speeches or inherited platforms. It was about carrying the burdens of a people, standing firm in storms that most would never endure. Looking at Traoré, still composed and dignified, Barron saw something unfamiliar. Strength without arrogance, authority without entitlement. The contrast cut deeply, exposing the fragility of his own assumptions about power. The audience no longer mattered. Barron's conflict was now internal, between the version of himself, who had spoken boldly, and the one who now felt the sting of humility. He wondered what it meant to inherit privilege without understanding responsibility, to speak, without listening to the echoes of history. For the first time, he questioned not Traoré's fitness, but his own readiness to face the truth of the world. The hall watched as his expression shifted, confidence giving, way to reflection. No apology came. No words could mend what had been said, but the weight of realization was visible. Barron had entered the summit to challenge Traoré, yet he was the one being transformed. In that silent reckoning, he took his first step out of the shadow of his inheritance, though he did not yet know where that path would lead. The hall erupted, not in debate, but in a rising wave of applause. It began softly with a few students, clapping from the back rows, and grew until the sound filled every corner of the chamber. The ovation was not directed at Barron, nor was it even solely for Ibrahim Traoré. It was for the truth that had been unearthed, for the forgotten promise that demanded recognition, and for the dignity that stood unshaken in the face of insult. Traoré remained seated, acknowledging the applause with a slight nod, his composure unbroken. He had spoken no words, yet the moment belonged to him. His silence had drawn out the arrogance in his opponent, and the recording had provided the vindication. He did not need to claim victory because the hall itself had given it to him. The applause was not for performance, but for presence, for patience, for resilience. Barron lowered his eyes, absorbing the scene with a heavy heart. He had wanted to challenge Traoré, to expose him as unworthy, but instead had exposed a gap in his own understanding. Watching the audience rise, he saw that leadership was not about commanding a stage, but embodying a cause greater than oneself. It was a lesson he had not expected to learn, yet one that might stay with him far longer than his words. As the applause continued, the hall seemed to transform into something more than a gathering place. It became a symbol of reconciliation between past and present, between broken promises and renewed dignity. What had started as a confrontation ended as a reminder. Truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. In that moment, the world saw Traoré not as unfit, but as a living answer to a promise that history could no longer deny. The session ended, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. In the wide marble corridors outside the chamber, clusters of students gathered, their voices rising with excitement. They replayed Barron's words, then compared them to the recording, weaving their own interpretations of what leadership should mean. Some spoke of betrayal by past powers, others of pride in Traoré's composure, but all agreed they had witnessed history shift before their eyes. Diplomats, more cautious in tone, huddled in small circles. They whispered about how the incident would reshape alliances, how Africa's voice could no longer be dismissed so easily. A few admitted privately that they had underestimated Traoré, believing him too young, too inexperienced. Now they were forced to reconsider. The silence he had wielded spoke louder than speeches they had heard in decades of summits. It was as though a new standard for dignity had been set. In the press lounge, journalists typed feverishly, phones buzzed with editors demanding headlines. They argued over the narrative. Was it Barron's blunder or Traoré's triumph? Some framed it as a generational clash, others as a moment of redemption for a forgotten promise. Yet, no matter the angle, one truth was clear. The summit would be remembered not for policy discussions, but for the confrontation that had redefined the meaning of presence and truth in leadership. News of the exchange spread faster than the snowflakes falling outside the Geneva Hall. Within hours, television networks from New York to Nairobi replayed the clip on an endless loop. Barron's sharp accusation of Traoré, followed by the forgotten recording, created a sequence too dramatic to ignore. Anchors spoke of humiliation, redemption, and history colliding in real time. Each replay carried the same electric silence, the moment when the past spoke louder than the present. In Washington, pundits debated furiously. Some mocked Barron for his reckless words, while others sympathized, claiming he was a victim of youthful inexperience. Yet, across the ocean, African commentators framed the story differently. For them, the real headline was Traoré's restraint and the resurrection of a promise long denied. Newspapers in Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Accra ran front pages celebrating the dignity of silence, hailing the young leader as a man who would let truth fight on his behalf. Social media turned the incident into a storm of its own. Hashtags multiplied, unfit, but unbroken. Forgotten promise, Jacatria silence. Young Africans posted clips with captions about sovereignty and pride, while American users debated whether Barron had exposed his immaturity or unintentionally performed an act of honesty. Memes spread, some mocking Barron's expression as the recording played, others lifting Traoré into a symbolic figure of global respect. The digital world became a battlefield of interpretation. Inside major newsrooms, editors sensed more than a political drama. They sensed a cultural shift. They framed the story as a turning point where the arrogance of inherited privilege collided with the endurance of earned respect. Traoré's still image sitting quietly while history defended and became iconic. For once, Africa's story was not written by outsiders. It was revealed by its own dignity, carried to the world by the very forces that had once sought to silence it. When the cameras dimmed and the applause faded, Barron sought a quieter moment. The corridors of the conference center stretched long and cold, lined with portraits of past leaders whose eyes seemed to follow every step. He asked one of the aides to arrange a meeting not out of duty, but out of a restless need. Hours later, in a small private room with low lighting and heavy curtains, Barron entered to find Tro already waiting. The African leader rose only slightly, offering a nod instead of a handshake. The silence between them was heavier than any word. Barron sat across from him, his earlier confidence gone. The fire in his speech had burned out, leaving only ashes of doubt. He fumbled with his notes, then pushed them aside, realizing they were useless now. I thought I was defending strength, he began, his voice lower than before. But I see now I was only defending what I inherited, not what I understand. The words carried hesitation, as though each one demanded courage he had not needed at the podium. Traoré listened without interruption. His eyes, steady and unblinking, gave nothing away, yet his silence urged Barron to continue. The young American shifted in his chair, trying to fill the void. He spoke of the shadow of his family name, of the burden of expectation that never allowed him to speak as himself. He admitted he had looked at Traoré through the lens of prejudice, not curiosity. The act of confessing these truths unsettled him, but he felt oddly lighter with each admission. At last, Traoré leaned forward. His words were few, spoken softly, yet they cut deeper than any lecture. Leadership is not about inheritance, he said. It is about carrying what others cannot, even when no one applauds you. He paused, letting the sentence breathe, then added, if you seek truth, listen more than you speak. The quiet tone carried more power than Barron's earlier declaration in front of the cameras. It was not advice. It was a challenge. Barron nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the moment. He realized that the silence he had mocked was, in truth, a discipline he had never learned. Across the table sat a man younger than many world leaders, yet older in spirit than Barron had ever felt. The conversation did not end with reconciliation or promises, but with a seed planted. As Barron stood to leave, he understood that the summit had not humiliated him. It had offered him the first lesson of his life. In Ouagadougou, the capital pulsed with energy as people gathered around flickering televisions and buzzing radios. The clip from Geneva was replayed and crowded. Cafes and street markets filled with the smell of roasted maize, and even in quiet, living rooms lit by kerosene lamps. Each replay of Barron's insult and the recording that followed drew gasps, laughter, and murmurs of pride. For many Burkinabé, it was not simply news. It was vindication. Their leader had faced disrespect before the world, and answered with silence that spoke louder than any speech. In Dar, students filled university courtyards, debating the meaning of the moment. Some saw it as a generational turning point, proof that Africa could no longer be dismissed by voices from abroad. Others argued that it was only symbolic, yet even they admitted the symbolism carried. Wait! Posters of Thomas Sankara appeared overnight, plastered on walls, beside images of Ibrahim Traoré. Conversations swirled with references to dignity, sovereignty, and a long chain of leaders who had carried Africa's burdens across rural villages where internet signals were faint but word of mouth was strong. Elders recounted the scene to younger listeners. They described how an insult was transformed into respect, how silence became power. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining the hall in Geneva as though it were a stage from a fable. Farmers in the fields repeated the story between strokes of their hoes, treating it not as distant politics, but as proof that their lives mattered in the eyes of the world in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and beyond. The ripple continued. Commentators on African television channels called a moment of reclamation. Musicians began writing songs about it, weaving Traoré silence into rhythm and verse. Social media across the continent surged with pride, not only in Traoré, but in the collective spirit of African identity. What happened in Geneva was no longer just about one leader. It had become the echo of a continent, reclaiming its voice louder with each passing day. As the summit closed, the Great Hall emptied, leaving behind only echoes of what had taken place. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Geneva in a quiet stillness that contrasted with the storm now spreading across the world. Ibrahim Traoré walked through the corridors with the same calm that had defined him on stage, his steps unhurried, his gaze steady. Baron following at a distance, carried with him not triumph, but questions that would not leave him even after the lights of the summit dimmed. On the flight back to Washington, Baron replayed the recording in his mind. The voice of the forgotten statesman seemed to follow him, haunting and instructive. He thought of the words he had spoken so easily, declaring another man unfit, and felt their hollowness settle deeper each time. For the first time he considered what it meant to listen before speaking, to carry responsibility not as an inheritance but as a chosen burden. The silence of Traoré lingered in his memory more vividly than his own speech. Meanwhile, across Africa, the moment was retold in countless ways. In schools, teachers used it to illustrate lessons on dignity and sovereignty. In markets, vendors repeated the story as though passing down folklore. For elders, it was proof that the sacrifices of generations had not been forgotten. For the youth, it was a call to continue pushing for respect and self-determination. The future felt unwritten, but it was being shaped already in the pride reflected on so many faces. Geneva had not solved anything, nor had it erased the injustices of the past, but it had planted something, a reminder that history does not remain buried forever, and that truth once unearthed demands recognition. As Traoré boarded his plane home, and Baron returned to his world of shadows and expectations, both men carried the same reality. The next chapter would not be decided by speeches alone, but by how each would live with a silence that had changed everything. What began as an insult ended as a powerful lesson in dignity and truth. History spoke louder than pride, and the world listened. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that reveal hidden truths.